In this video, we're going to be rebuilding the front calipers on our 1975 Mercedes 280 SL. We're going to be using a rebuild kit from Big Red here. I'm going to be running over the pros and cons of rebuilding as opposed to simply going out and buying a new set of calipers. We're also going to be touching on whether it's better to powder coat the calipers, which is what we've done here, or whether you can simply get away with painting them, and if you do paint them, what kind of paint you're likely to need. Having spent days getting the pistons out of these calipers, I could just put the new pistons and seals on, but I'm not going to do that. I'm actually going to give these calipers to Paul, the soda blaster, and I'm going to see if we can get rid of all of this corrosion, get rid of all of this dirt on the outside of the calipers, and make these look like new again. Now, if you do get your calipers sandblasted, or media blasted, glass bead blasted, it is almost inevitable you're going to get some media left in the threads. So, for example, the threads here where these bolts screw into, you need to ideally chase those threads, or what we're going to do is just go through there with a Dremel tool, and what you'll see is all of this stuff here coming out of the threads. So you definitely don't want to be screwing these bolts in before you've done that and then ruining the threads. The other thing I would suggest is these little holes here that the brake fluid comes through to push the pistons out. I would go through each one of those holes with a piece of braided wire, slightly unraveled at the end, to get rid of any little leftover bits of sand or media if you've had these sandblasted, because if you get those in here when you put the pistons in, you'll end up scratching the bore and ruining your caliper. The last thing worth mentioning is that these calipers, once you've stripped them and sandblasted them, will start to rust within days, if not hours. So you do need to decide whether to paint them or powder coat them. We're going to get these powder coated just because it'll give us a more durable finish, and also because in my experience, when you are bleeding brakes, you almost inevitably get brake fluid running down the calipers, and that brake fluid is extremely corrosive to paint and will end up dissolving it. So we're going for powder coating, be slightly more expensive, takes slightly longer, but I think will give us a more durable finish. We initially had our front calipers sandblasted, glass bead blasted, and it cost us £30 per caliper, so a total of £60. But when they came back, I realized that if we left them like that, they would simply rust again. So what I should have done is taken these calipers to the powder coating place, which could have sandblasted them and powder coated them for us. In the event, I took them to the powder coating place, and it cost us £50 per caliper to have them powder coated. So that is in total £160 to have these sandblasted and powder coated. The caliper rebuild kit here is by a company called Big Red, and we got a great deal on this. It cost us just over £40 delivered, and I'll leave a link at the end of the video to where we got that from. That consists of the 4 pistons and the rubber seals that you'll need, plus some special grease for greasing the pins. If you do go down the powder coating route, the masking up of the calipers is what takes the time, and it has to be done really, really well, because you don't want any of the mating surfaces or the internal cylinder bore getting damaged in any way. So we're going to take off this protective coating now. First thing we're going to do is put in this square seal here. Now, some people lubricate this seal here with brake fluid prior to putting it in, and some people put it in dry. I'm going to put it in dry and lubricate the outside of the seal. Before you seat that seal, just make sure there's no grit or grime in there. You can go through that channel with a little wire wheel, little Dremel wire wheel like this. There is nothing special about putting this seal in. You just need to make sure it's not kinked or twisted in any way. For example, that there is kinked, and we just need that to be completely straight like that. The next thing is to get the piston in. Now, it does help here if you lubricate the side with a little bit of brake fluid, and when you push the piston in, you should be able to do it with just the force of your hands, Make sure you don't kink it to one side. Sometimes just having a flat piece of wood on there and either using a vise or a G-clamp, or in fact a workmate, will do it. What you shouldn't do, although some people do, is use this grease to grease the piston. Just use a little bit of brake fluid and that'll work fine. Now, the dust seals on different cars fit differently. On the Mercedes R107, it's relatively easy to put the dust seal on. That goes on first, and then the piston goes in. Sometimes the dust seal sits inside the actual piston hole there, and you have to put it on at the bottom and then slide it on that way. But as I say, in this particular case, it's relatively easy. The one thing you need to note, though, is these two cutouts here. They line up with these heat shields like so, and this cutout is at the top of the piston like that. Okay, where the bolt holes are, that's where that little cutout goes. If you are going to be lubricating the bottom of the piston with brake fluid, just bear in mind that it is quite corrosive, and ideally you do not want to be getting it on your hands if at all possible. So if all has gone to plan, you should just be able to push that down. This, importantly, has a metal snap ring, not snap ring, but a ring all the way around it. It's important that that seats down firmly right at the bottom all the way around. It's a really tight fit. Now, we all have our own way of doing things, but if you lubricate the outside of this with grease, the dust seal will not be as tight as it otherwise would be, and therefore has a greater propensity to come off like that. And secondly, obviously, the minute you start putting grease in there, you're going to be attracting a whole load of dirt and dust. So if you can avoid putting grease in there, my advice would be to do so. Would start putting the dust seal on these bits here and leave this bit till last, because this bit you can see that the dust seal is seated properly, whereas around here, for example, it's harder to see that. Now, we are going to put a little bit of high temperature lithium grease on this fitting here, one to help it go in, and two just to protect it from rust in the future. You might need to just get a little block of wood and tap that in gently. When you've tapped that down, just make sure that it's sitting flush inside that piston. Once you've completed putting the pistons in both of the calipers, you just need to put these tiny little rubber seals in here, and these go in the threaded part of the cylinder, i.e. these holes here are the threaded holes. Now, I had hoped to replace all these bolts with stainless steel bolts, but it transpires that these stainless steel bolts have a 17mm head. You can get 16mm heads from Accu, but in actual fact, the ones that came off are a 15mm head, and the significance of that is that there's a little inset there. So we're going to put back on the bolts that we took off, and these need to be torqued, first of all, to 12 foot-pounds, and then to 24 foot-pounds. So it's a two-stage torquing for these bolts here. If you have gone to the effort of refurbishing your calipers, you should ideally get new brake bleed nipples, and we haven't done so yet. We've just cleaned this up on a wire wheel, but I will do that at a later date. And similarly, the pins and bracket here, I do actually have a set of these somewhere, I just can't find them at the moment. It's worth renewing those. You will notice that I have not yet opened the sachet of silicone grease from Big Red, and that's because the very last thing to do is to grease these pins here, because those pins are the pins upon which the brake pads slide back and forwards when you put your foot on the brake. And if you have any corrosion on those pins or rust or anything like that, and they're not adequately lubricated, you may find that your brake pads do not spring back and start sticking and wear down unevenly as a result. It seems like a long time ago since we first took these calipers off to see if they would actually move, having remade all the brake lines. And in this particular case, these calipers were knackered and we had to drill them out effectively. But the question is, should you or would I refurbish calipers again, or simply buy a new set? I think unless you've got some kind of rare or ultra expensive calipers, for example, the calipers on our SL55 are something like £600 each if you can get hold of them. But the calipers for the R107 are readily available, and as long as you're not too precious whether or not they're 80E original ones or something else, I think I would advise actually just getting a new set of calipers as opposed to going through the rigmarole of refurbishing the existing ones. So to put that in perspective, these two rear calipers, brand new rear calipers, they don't come with the brake pads or the spring kit. They cost just £78 delivered, whereas to refurbish each one of these front calipers, now the front calipers are bigger and are going to be a little bit more expensive, but to refurbish each one of these front calipers costs just over £100. So with the benefit of hindsight, I think I'd just go out and get myself some reproduction calipers. Now these pins have these spring-loaded clips at the end, and the idea is that those clips are actually seated all the way into the hole, and to get them in there can be quite tricky, and it's a good idea first of all to make sure you've got some grease on the outside to lubricate them, and sometimes to actually try and squeeze that clip closed a little bit while you tap the pin in. So when that pin is properly seated, it'll be all the way in like that, and the end of the pin will be coming out like that. So I'm just doing one first and then putting the clip in because it's slightly easier that way around. If you are refurbishing your calipers, the one thing to consider is whether to paint them or powder coat them. If you can afford to powder coat them and you can afford the delay, these are actually done for us in just a few days, I would definitely get them powder coated, because in my experience the powder coating gives a far more durable, long-lasting finish. And if you paint the calipers, some people insist that you should use high temperature paint, and other people say that automotive paint is absolutely fine. I suspect that automotive paint is absolutely fine, because if you think about how hot a car gets out in the sunshine, I'm sure it'll be fine. But the one thing you should notice is that when you are bleeding brakes, etc., you are bound to get brake fluid on your calipers, and you might think you've wiped it off really thoroughly, but that brake fluid will corrode the paint and therefore will presumably lead to rust in the future. So my advice would be, if you can afford it, powder coat the calipers. You'll get an excellent finish. Having put these calipers back together, I realised that I made a schoolboy error with the first caliper that we put together. Namely, I put one of the old seals inside it, which stupidly I put inside the big red box, because when I put everything together I realised I had one seal left over. So I'm going to attempt to take this caliper to pieces again, and to do that I'm just going to use this DeWalt air compressor. We've already pushed out one of these pistons, and we're just using the little plastic fitting that actually comes with it here, and I'm hoping to be able to push this other piston here out. So let's just try that. We'll turn this up to say 20 psi and see what happens. You can see that that piston is actually coming out, which is great. And then we'll take that up to 30 psi and that piston should come shooting out. There you go. When I took this apart again, I made the mistake of trying to get this piston in by putting the seal on first and then pushing it in with this piece still intact, and that does not work. You will end up ripping the seal if you did that, which is exactly what I did. But thankfully Big Red were very kind enough to send me a new seal the very next day, so big thanks to them. The way to do it is to take the heat shield off, put the seal on first, and then slide the piston in. I'm going to leave this video here just with where we got the calipers and caliper rebuild kits, etc. We've got all the calipers back on. It is not a 5-minute job getting those calipers on, especially when the car is immobile and tucked up against the wall like this. In the next video, we're going to be bleeding the master cylinder, filling this up with hydraulic fluid, and hopefully wiring up the electrics to the switch here. And then I think all we need to do is connect the prop shaft or drive shaft underneath, turn the car on and see if it moves. We got our piston and seal kit from Big Red. If you ask them nicely, they might give you a 10% discount. We ended up paying £42 delivered, and they sent this out in super quick time, basically next day delivery. And similarly, when we managed to damage one of our seals, they sent us another one for next day delivery. Fantastic service. We use these guys here, Bristol Motorcycle Powder Coating. That's their telephone number up there. They always do stuff super quickly and, in my experience, relatively good price as well. We got our rear calipers, both of them, for just £74.61 delivered from these guys here on eBay, RTG Automotive. That puts it in perspective what it actually costs new versus what it costs to refurbish.